You're listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.
Hi, this is Louisa Tanner Munson, and I'm here now to talk a little bit more about Chiron through the houses. In particular, this is Chiron through the second house. So what happens if you're born with Chiron in the second house in your birth chart? And what is likely to happen when Chiron goes through, i.e. transits through your second house? So there's a slightly different meaning with each of these, but if you remember, Chiron represents the wounded healer. That's the main archetype for Chiron. So it represents our childhood wounds and where they may have originated from, and also how we can let go of them and transcend those, which so many of us actually do now, or at least attempt to. So the second house, the first thing we need to think about is, what does the second house represent? And traditionally, if you were to look up second house issues, the first few words you'd get would be money, attachments to possessions. It's very much a material asset place. That said, the word value always seems to come up in that, and I think, especially, I've actually got quite a bit in my second house, and there are some people that think if you have stuff in the second house, then you're likely to be quite wealthy and affluent and be able to work with your assets, etc. I have a separate interpretation of the second house, in as much as it gets us questioning the value of things. So I would like to put into this group that there is a deeper meaning to the second house, which isn't just about possessions. It is about values and the meanings of possessions and what things might really represent. So here, when you have Chiron in the second house, the first thing I've noticed, having looked through the charts of quite a few of my clients and family members and people that I know who have second house Chiron, one thing that comes up again and again and again is an insecurity about themselves, that they have self-value problems, that they don't feel like they're good enough, that they don't feel like they're loving enough, and a certain amount of guilt about not being good enough. Now, where this guilt comes from is anyone's question, really, because knowing some of these people, as I've got to over the years, I've learned that nothing necessarily terrible occurred to them in their childhoods. They had loving parents, possibly distant parents, but they didn't have any of the classic telltale symptoms of things that may have given them a real obvious evidence as to why they're not good enough. So these are people who in their programming somehow doubt themselves and have not put a high value on who they are. So the wounding here, represented by the wounded healer, is almost that these people, or people born with a second house Chiron, feel somehow not good enough and guilty about it, and it's their own self-judgment. So they may well come from loving but possibly distant families, but whatever happens in early childhood, the message is some kind of poverty of the soul. So for very sensitive types who aren't very materialistic, that really can get translated as not good enough, not loving enough, not worthy enough. If I was this would happen. And these are decisions that were probably made early on in childhood, with a child's brain, and unfortunately, we're all adults here, living with the consequences of our beliefs that we made as children. And I've noticed with people born with a second house Chiron that some of these early beliefs about themselves really don't help them and really don't serve them, and they'll fight you for it as well. So there is a questing for value in their relationships. And so I've noticed that with these people, their feelings of insecurity within their family setup has left them wanting to create the perfect family and wanting to invest everything into their families and to be loved by their families. only to find later on that if they didn't correct their initial belief system about themselves, that they're not good enough, that gets them projected into their family. So they find themselves with partners who possibly don't show them that they are good enough, or who may put them down, or just subtly undermine them, or families that they perceive as rejecting them, like families with children that move away. I've got 2 clients very close to me who have a history of finding themselves in family situations where they feel like they're abandoned in some way. And sure enough, their kids have grown up, and in their decisions to live their lives independently and to live in different parts of the world, these mothers and fathers have, with their own wounding, translated that as, if I was good enough, my children would stay close by, or so they've made it sort of personal. One of the things that I notice about this is where these feelings are unchecked, and where the people who've born with a second house Chiron don't challenge the assumptions that they've made about themselves, about not being good enough, then this ramps up quite considerably. For those ambitious people that really like to have their belief systems confirmed again and again and again, it can become that these people become a little bit manipulative to show that they're good enough, and start throwing guilt around a little bit, or trying to make people feel guilty for them. So there's a little bit of a guilt throwing, guilt catching complex going on there as well, which often leads to the situation becoming more and more unbearable for them. When I've looked at people with Chiron in this position, there is also an insecurity about money, as you'd expect with the second house, because it is to do with money and possessions and attachments. There's also, at first, a real difficulty in sharing their belongings. There's this feeling that, no, this is mine. And the wounding comes from losing that sense of material comfort. Possibly they were growing up in a time when material comforts were hard to come by. I'm not entirely sure, but there is also a slight fear that there's not enough. So there's a fear that they aren't enough, and there's a fear that they don't have enough. So again, this is all about values, and it all compounds with this need to hold on to things. And hold on to their emotions. Now, where I've seen this being really transformed, and it can really be transformed and be very, very liberating and freeing, is when people are open to, are really, really open to self-help. Because a lot of people who deal in guilt and feel not good enough aren't very vocal about it. They tend to keep it hidden like it's a dark secret. And guilt and shame and those kinds of emotions tend to be quite secretive. So a lot of these people aren't likely to be very open about it, unless they're seeking professional help, or, as many of them do, become self-help fans. So people who reach for self-help straight away, which is a great thing, and has helped many, many people. In fact, I've enjoyed the self-help genre myself over the years. So there are absolute opportunities for transformation for people who are wise enough and brave enough. I think it's courage, actually. Courageous enough to go for the self-help and to help relieve themselves of these situations, because they are really, really deep-seated in the second house. Like I said, the second house is about values and holding on to what, clinging on to things. So this is... this is quite important stuff. If you think of the star signs, that the star sign associated with the second house is Taurus, and Taurus is a fixed sign. It is, routinely called the bull, and you're not going to really budge on a bull. But I also think of Taurus as being oak tree energy. It's a tree that grows so strong and big, and its roots go on deep into the unconscious mind, it's very, very difficult to shift the beliefs that we make about ourselves in the second house. So I often find things like hypnotherapy, things that actually go to reprogram the mind, reprogram the roots, are really, really beneficial. I've seen some people become coaches who have this kind of setup, because you have to really go through your pain to be able to understand how to transcend it in other people. And so it's not unusual to find people with the second house Chiron making a career out of it. In the first house Chiron example, I saw people being kind of spiritual movers and shakers and being spiritual leaders, almost like they are connected to source energy, connected to the spirit of ascended masters and things like that. So you see lots of spiritual movements with the first house Chiron. The second house Chiron, I definitely see it more as coaches and people that work with people on an individual one-to-one level, primarily because that's the way that they prefer to work, in private, and working with the secrecy and the guilt and the shame and all those things that are hidden. So this is actually a very difficult Chiron placement, for sure, because it's so hidden. The wounds are so hidden, and yet they're always there, sort of informing the conscious mind how it needs to behave. Now, what happens when Chiron goes from the first house into the second house? So, for instance, if your Chiron is elsewhere, in your birth chart, but you notice that it's about to transit from the first house to the second house, this is what you've got to look forward to. So I would imagine if you've just had Chiron going through your first house, that you've been on a bit of a spiritual awakening trip. Your understanding of who you are and your relationship to the cosmos has been upgraded quite rapidly, I would imagine. That often happens because of extreme pain that causes it. So what I would imagine is, in the last few years, you'd have had some quite painful moments forcing you to change the way you believe about the world and your place in it, and from that would have come a cycle of growth, and it will also have probably made you think more acutely about your health, the way you look, and the way you come across in the public domain. Now, as the Chiron energy moves from the first house to the second house, what's going on is this shift is continuing, but going at a deeper level. So rather than it being about your place in the world and the way you present yourself, the way you look, the way you sound, and some of the teachers that you may have around you, as Chiron moves into the second house, you're going into a deepening of healing, whereby your attachment to things will be challenged. So you'll be learning whether you actually do need the bucket loads of cash that you think you do, whether you really do need that posh house, whether you really do need the car, whether you really do need to live in the neighbourhood you live in, etc., etc. All those things that you may have built up around you, possession-wise, and to do with your lifestyle, will be brought into question. It might be that during a Chiron in the second house transit, that you become aware that your lifestyle is unsustainable and is actually harmful for the planet that you've just recently connected to and felt a part of. So it's a bit like the information just deepens and deepens, and then you're forced with a realization that you have a part to play in this. And the thing that is holding you back is your attachments to your beliefs, your attachments to guilt, or your attachments to unforgiveness. So there's some huge themes going on with the second house Chiron. And due to the nature of the second house, i.e. that it's kind of fixed and quite stubborn and very earthy by nature, this is a transiting place that creates all sorts of issues that bubble up and are difficult, and we're reluctant to resolve. But good luck to anybody that is going through this, or who indeed has a second house Chiron. It's almost like a sneaky place for Chiron to be, because on the surface, because the second house stuff is quite hidden, on the surface everything looks okay. Like, the childhood that you had looked pretty normal. And your upbringing was probably pretty normal. The way you appeared was probably very normal, and it all really hides the insecurity and the wounded feelings, or the feelings of not being good enough. So yeah, it's quite a deep placement. Anyway, I hope that's useful for any of you with the second house Chiron, or for any of you that have Chiron transiting through your second house. Of course, this energy does move on to the third house, which I'm going to record now. But this is all part of the healing journey. And if you want any of this explained or worked through on a one-to-one level, then just give me a shout. Take care.
You've been listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson, and this recording has been made possible by all you lovely supporters at Patreon. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.